This takes me back. Friday was unlike any others. I'd wait the entire week for it to come so I could go home and watch SmackDown. Remember that time you used to slow down in anticipation? And in this instance, I don't really remember what sitcom was on before the show started, but I didn't care about anything that was on until the show began. I remember being absolutely pissed that I couldn't watch the Halloween episode because of something. I don't even know why to this very day. It wasn't even on the channel. And regardless, at the time, it was wrestling day and night. At school, they'd be talking about wrestling, and at home, I'd either be playing the games or watching the shows. SmackDown 2008 to 2009 was during the peak of my WWE fandom. I was into the product a little too much looking back, and I'd be watching a lot of old-ass videos on YouTube. Remember my bro showed me this WWE's fake video with the fake it music in the background. If you know, you know. Fun times. I think we could all agree that SmackDown 2008 to 2009 was where it's at. The show was so damn good for a multitude of reasons. The star power. Obviously, throughout the years, SmackDown had a stacked roster, but after a while, it was time for new faces, and that's what we got with the likes of Triple H and Jeff Hardy joining the brand. The game had been a cornerstone of Monday nights for several years, to the point where many thought it was impossible for him to leave, but he finally did work Tuesdays. I was excited for the other side as well. You had Rey Mysterio, a man who essentially bled blue on Raw. It was kind of weird to see these guys switch brands, and on the other side, it gave others the opportunity to step up, or in MVP's case, fall off. I don't do these videos that often because, well, they're kind of frustrating to make, but the end product's always cool, so there's that. Like every other era of pro wrestling, there's always some things that are forgotten or are so bad, people prefer not to mention them. In 08-09 SmackDown's case, there's some. I mean, how many people remember Hayden Vanson? This man was apparently pitched to lead a faction of misfits who would go after The Undertaker, and it's like something straight from Scott Pilgrim or something. I don't know. He'd go through them and face Vanson at WrestleMania. He had one vignette and was gone, and to be honest with you, I do not remember this man. This man was gone before he even arrived. He didn't even have a chance because, one, he was short, and two, he didn't have many supporters in the back. That's the ultimate 1-2 punch in 2000's WWE. He looked like a decent promo, although it's hard to tell after one promo. And there weren't many guys that were released as quick as Hayden Vanson. Unlike him, these next couple of guys actually did something on TV. And when I mean they did something, I mean just that, literally. The only thing they accomplished was appearing on TV. Kazarian is one that comes to mind. If you don't get it, well, his name I assume is a play on Carney, a carnival lunatic basically. On paper, this gimmick kind of seems fresh, like a 2008 Doink who'd wreak havoc on the WWE. It wasn't going to be a clown, obviously, but you get the point. There's a mix of Doink and Rob Zombie, according to Kazarian himself. He also claims that everyone else saw him as a heel, whereas Vince saw him as a babyface. He ended up being a babyface who nobody cared about before he knew it. Well, he was released after 2 months on the main roster. The debut didn't please the guys in the back, and he fell off. It happens a lot. You know, some guys get 20 chances, whereas others mess up on their first try and are gone. In Kazarian's case, he was unlucky. Speaking of unlucky, a bunch of the indie guys from the 2000s had some terrible luck upon signing with the WWE. You know, it's like featuring on a Madden cover from that decade. Enter Scotty Goldman. This man's gimmick was literally that he's Jewish, and despite having a decent career on the indies, did nothing of note in the WWE. His first match was literally his peak in the company. He got a bit of offense there, and following the match, he was involved in squash matches. Other than that, he had this WWE.com show, which is what most people remember from his run. It was some dumb comedy, and after screwing up a finish with Umaga was released. I don't think he was entirely released because of this, but it got him noticed for the wrong reasons. On the other side of things, if he did some of that goofy stuff a few years later, I think it would go down differently. For the better, of course. Among other forgotten people were Jay Bradley, who did nothing of note except wrestle 2 matches. Mr. Kennedy, who didn't wrestle much after a month, and he shouldn't be around here, but this man only had 5 matches, and the only time he appeared again was to promote his movie. Other than these guys, everyone who featured on SmackDown had a purpose on the show. Now, before I move on to other things, I'd just like to mention the theme song for the show. You know, If You Rock Like Me. Honestly, this theme song's off. You know, as a kid, the theme songs for the shows used to hype me up. You know, I'd hear To Be Loved on Raw's side, and I'd be like, it's time. SmackDown, they had Rise Up, and I was ready to see Batista wreck the opposition. I'd be messing with some pillows or whatever, but this song is just there. It just doesn't feel like a wrestling song at all. Luckily, that's one of the worst things about 08-09 SmackDown, and that problem would be rectified in a big way as they brought a song that got me hyped to watch SmackDown again. It's just a minor thing. The Divas Division. This is where I'd say SmackDown 2008 to 2009 did the most work on. Throughout the history of the brand split, the women's division was mostly exclusive for Raw, whereas SmackDown just had some woman out there doing whatever. They didn't wrestle, and when they did, it was forgettable. SmackDown didn't even have a women's title, nor did it have a proper division. For the first time in ever, they actually had a better / more consistent women's division than Raw's, and they actually had a title, which was a first for the blue brand. At least in my opinion. Let me explain why. On the Raw side, you had Mickie James, who was doing absolutely nothing at one point. They had 100 tag team matches that lasted shorter than a music video. And I'm not saying there weren't tag team matches on SmackDown, because there was. But unlike Raw, there was some stories relating to that. You know, the Bella Twins debuted and were committed to fooling their opponents to win matches. Soon enough, Victoria and Natalya caught on and tried doing something about them. Like, even though this was no golden age for women's division, trust me, it's far from it, they were putting in far more effort than compared to Raw. Like, for example, Michelle McCool. She was this manager slash occasional wrestler who wasn't doing much. Suddenly, she got pushed and turned into the most prominent diva of the roster. Coupled with her improved in-ring skills and a character change, it made Mccool a focal point of the division. Plus, her heel turn had a story to it, you know. She was champion, she slowly got arrogant, she slowly got angry at Maria, and lashed out on her and Eve. It set her up very well for the next 2 years as she was the #1 woman on SmackDown. Maurice debuted earlier in the year and already made a name for herself. Her character was elegant, arrogant, saw everyone else as beneath her. She wasn't out of this world as a wrestler, but she was a damn good promo, and her facial expressions were, damn, she's snotty. Back to her in-ring skills, they're pretty good for that time period. Compared to others, that's a different story, but here, they're decent enough. She also had that awesome Pourquoi song, which brings me back to SVR 2010. When you compare it to the women of today, she is overlooked. I don't think she's better than them, but for that era's women's division, she was one of the very best overall on SmackDown. From in-ring to promos, Victoria was another notable talent, somewhat. She never really did much and was just a veteran putting over talent such as the Bella Twins. When she learned that there was no plans for her, she opted to leave and did it with a bang. Natalya, she was a fresh talent at the time. For one, she stood out for her Hart family background and her supreme in-ring skills. I'm not interested in Natalya these days, but from 2008 to 2011, she was one of the best women's wrestlers in ring. Eve, she was mostly a jobber because she left her interview job. Maria did have a personal feud with Michelle, but was more of an on-screen personality rather than wrestler. Oh, her song's iconic, you can't tell me otherwise. And overall, looking back on this division, it was definitely an improvement over what SmackDown had in the past. They had a title now, more time to wrestle, and looking back on it from today, you're thinking, this sucks. But you have to look at it from a 2008 perspective. You gotta wear those shutter shades Kanye West used to wear during that time period to understand that it was a significant upgrade over the previous years. The division was revamped and featured fresh talent. And once again, I'm not saying it's a world-class era, an era that was majestic, but it was definitely better than what the Blue brand had to offer in the previous years. In other places, the lower card of SmackDown 2008 to 2009 was bizarre. Funaki suddenly revealed that his first name was Kung, and you know where this is going, you know, they started calling him Kung Funaki, and had this parody to the Kung Fu Fighting song, and this man had a lethal crane kick, but it only worked on MVP of all people. Jimmy Wang Yang was still sort of there, but unfortunately he was taking a lot of L's and his time passed on, you know. After 2007, they didn't really see him the same way that they used to. There was Gregory Helms, who finally made his return from injury and found his positioning on the card was much lower than before, and he was back to being the Hurricane and lacked the fire that he had previously. In the past, I could see Gregory Helms as US champ with his 2007 look, but after he was back, they didn't see him that way. His run here was actually forgettable, and I should note that he used to randomly pop up on the screen criticizing or making fun of a bunch of wrestlers. Jesse and Festus, same thing. They didn't feature so much, and the only thing I remember was the moment John Morrison and The Miz found a hack to his aggression, and even then they screwed up. There were some other guys that wrestled on the roster like Kenny Dykstra, but they literally had 2 matches before getting released. Moving on, let's talk about the more memorable wrestlers slash storylines. The Brian Kendrick bursted onto the scene in a tag team with Paul London. He enjoyed success capturing the tag team titles and setting a then record 334 days with the gold. Unfortunately though, somebody smiled and they suffered. Kendrick wanted to be his own man, and when he got the chance, shined. With Ezekiel Jackson by his side, Brian Kendrick became this very conceited philosopher who thought he was much bigger than he was. I mean, this guy had a V by his name. That tells you all you need to know. He'd do that stupid walk and destroy some jobber. He had some momentum by his side in the early fall, and at one point was even the interim WWE champion. The Brian Kendrick could have been a fluke US champion or something, but ultimately he fell off by the end of the year because of marijuana, and wasn't even in question for a mid-card feud. Ezekiel Jackson, on the other hand, did a bit better than Kendrick did. He'd be looking like he completed life with a shirt and the pants on, just waiting for somebody to mess with them. He eventually went on to ECW. The Great Khali. Khali's run this time around was so forgettable. He went from this menacing challenger for the WWE Championship to a lower card guy who was kissing fans. This man wasn't doing anything here, and you'd think with the push he had in the past, it'd be the contrary. Other than the Triple H program, I don't remember anything, you know, he just turned face and started dancing. There's not much to say other than that. On the rise, well technically, was newcomer R-Truth. Now clearly he had a run as K-Quick, but this was a bit different. Truth was now a single start and had a lot of experience under his belt. His character initially seemed like a man who was blessed for the opportunities given to him because of his struggles and mistakes in the past, and looking at these vignettes, it's very easy to root for R-Truth. He didn't make a name for himself during this era of SmackDown, but for me, he stood out for being the only guy on the roster that rapped his song to the ring. However, in the months following this era, he started to feature much more often than he did here. Umaga, the Samoan Bulldozer, was finally on SmackDown. Unfortunately, though, his run didn't get going. Despite this, he was booked strong as a huge threat that only the main eventers could beat, but he was gone for so long because of a knee injury. Otherwise, if that wasn't the case, I think it's guaranteed he would have feuded with Triple H or Jeff Hardy again. He's always been in there with the big guys, and the only time he feuded with a mid-carder was when he was the IC champion. Speaking of championships, let's talk about the tag team division for a moment. This is where I feel 2008 to 2009 SmackDown is at its weakest. Kurt Hawkins and Zack Ryder were the champions initially. They lost the titles and disappeared, and at this point the Colognes were the champs, and it made sense for Carlito and Primo to be champions. They were brothers, and, well, never mind. I was actually going to say something stupid, that being that they knew each other well. What do you expect? They're brothers. The tag team was floating around doing a load of nothing as champions, and they were on TV, but there wasn't intrigue or interest in the tag team division as previous years. The only other teams on the scene were Jesse and Festus and Brian Kendrick and Ezekiel Jackson. It was so dull that John Morrison and The Miz had to bring their titles over to feud with the Colognes to unify them. The unified tag titles experiment was a great idea because the rosters were lacking greatly in tag teams, and this proved to be one step closer to the end of the brand split. The Colognes had some decent matches, but ultimately nobody really remembers their run or any of the tag teams I just mentioned. When I think of the Colognes, all I think of is the Bella Twins and the whole John Morrison and this storyline. Okay, time to talk about the actual characters you guys think about when hearing 08-09 SmackDown. Guys such as Vladimir Koslov. Now, I think it goes without saying that Vladimir Koslov does not have a lot of support in general. He'd come out in the dark with a diaper on and would destroy the opposition before the main event began. Then they pushed him into the main event like he was an 80s villain. He did have this menacing look on his face, and if that was coupled with his in-ring skills later on, which I'm not saying were amazing or anything like that, but he was definitely better than he was in 2008, and his current day look, well, I'd say it's a different story. This man looks like a world champion now. The problem with Koslov at the time was, here's a big guy, we want you to see him as a threat, and it felt forced. Add to that, he didn't have much experience. Now, I'm not saying, oh, this big guy was going to be Shawn Michaels in the ring, but you can't really expect somebody that green in a main event position where they should deliver. More time, possibly. There's a chance he could have been better in that area. Also, this guy beat The Undertaker. Like, what? They did all of this for him and abandoned him after the draft. His run was a failed experiment, and after this, they just didn't take him as seriously as they did in 2008. Speaking of abandonment, MVP sort of fits the bill. Not outright, of course. Heading into 2008, MVP was probably the hottest prospect in the WWE. He showed a lot of confidence in the ring and on the mic. Montel's charismatic presence, along with his spoiled sports player character, made him one of the most must-watch wrestlers on the SmackDown roster. Post-draft, MVP was still the same, but suddenly he started losing like he was a jobber. This man started getting his stuff taken away, and the only thing he was gaining was sympathy from the crowd. Montel lost his confidence in everything that made him special. I mean, you know it's bad when you're losing to Funaki of all people. Like, this guy is 22 overall, yet MVP lost to him. In a way, this hurt MVP in his hot run, but it also opened up an opportunity to make him a babyface and do more with him. He got so desperate for a win, and it wasn't coming until Vicky Guerrero got Triple H involved. He had to interfere in Big Show's match with MVP to hand him the win because his spot in the Royal Rumble was in jeopardy. From here, MVP won more often and most importantly was a babyface. He was still douchey a bit, but to heels, and ended up capturing the US title at the end of this SmackDown run. So it wasn't all bad. Overall, he was set up real nice by the end of the run, as some actually believed his main event ascension would begin once he turned face. That didn't though. In other places, Big Show was turning heel and face. I mean, it's a given, it's the Big Show. He probably turns heel walking to the arena. At the time, his return was fresh, unlike the following years. He was slimmer and had decent to good matches with The Undertaker. Some of their matches from this time period are a bit overlooked. I'm not saying they're must-watch or anything like that, but if you were to watch them, I think you would enjoy them. But since Big Show is a magnet to bad storylines, he was once again attached to something horrendous. That being that Vicky Guerrero/Edge story, and the craziest part is, this was for the build of WrestleMania 25. You had Vicky cheating, John Cena roasting both men, and it was unpleasant. Then again, I liked seeing John Cena on SmackDown as a kid. Overall, Big Show's return to the squared circle was a welcoming one, at least from my perspective. It wasn't the same though as the years went by, as barring a few things, I wasn't that interested in him. Him and Kane, I just lost interest in them as the years went by. From the Big Show to The Undertaker, the measuring stick of Friday nights, the one man I always wished would move to Raw but didn't. Around here, he was in his absolute peak and was unstoppable. What I mean by this is Taker always had the character. Throughout his career, his characters were never the problems, but they saddled him with some green wrestlers and it was always terrible. After the Heidenreich thing, they started pairing him with established wrestlers and it resulted in some excellent programs. In 08-09, he concluded his intense feud with Edge by sending him to hell and had a program with a Big Show before finally getting that story with Shawn Michaels. The build to their match for the most part was weird with the inclusion of JBL and Koslov, but once they got past that, these two were firing on all cylinders and in Houston had the greatest WrestleMania match in history. JR was quoted as saying that he had an out-of-body experience watching it and it was so damn good. Taker was finally let loose, or translation, had opponents who were as good / better than him, and it resulted in classics such as this. I should also note that this was his final year where Taker was a full-time SmackDown wrestler, because after this he started going on hiatus after WrestleMania and returning on the summer. And looking back, SmackDown in the summer of 2009 didn't really need The Undertaker, but 2010s though, that's a different story. We got one more mid-carder left from this era of SmackDown, and I thought it's best to save him until this point. The gold standard, Shelton Benjamin. In the past few years, Shelton Benjamin had experienced a deep push of sorts. The commentary were singing his praises, WWE were airing a lot of his vignettes, but the moment he lost the title to Carlito, it was the beginning of the end. There was the Mama thing, and before he knew it, he was on ECW. This is also a bit of a positive because he got to reevaluate himself and it worked out great. He bleached his hair blonde, although that was beforehand, started treating himself like a top prospect and calling himself the gold standard. He finally captured gold, that being the United States Championship, and became the mid-card workhorse of the WWE. He faced the likes of R-Truth, Jeff Hardy, The Undertaker, and Triple H in some solid matches. He was always delivering and had that ridiculous athleticism. He makes it look so damn easy, and I still don't understand why he was sent to ECW after this. His US title run was definitely a highlight in his career, and I want to do something on it eventually. What made Shelton one of the best in the SmackDown era was his consistency. He went out there against high flyers, brawlers, and had some of the very best matches on the show. He lost the title at the right time to MVP, who needed that boost as a babyface, and overall, I'd say Shelton's time on the blue brand certainly ain't forgotten by me. When I think of this time period SmackDown, he's one of the first names I think of. Moving on, all we got left is the big SmackDown 3. Let's start with the man whose name is synonymous with SmackDown, the rated R superstar Edge. Man, this guy was all over the place. One moment he's annoying John Cena, and the next he's on SmackDown as a world champion. Anyone the Edge went up against, I'd support them, and almost every time he'd escape with his title. His hair's messy, and he'd have that grin on his face. Man, it's always been said in my videos, and one of you guys commented the other day saying they actually liked Edge, and I'm just wondering, like, was Edge your dad or something? Because I can't see a kid from that time period actually saying, I like this man. He managed to take the title away from The Undertaker, get rid of him. When he got his comeuppance, it wasn't like I felt bad for him. And one thing that's noticeable about this era of SmackDown is the lack of Edge. He was gone after a few weeks, but before I knew it, he was back to terrorizing the lives of my favorites. He took Jeff Hardy's spot in the Triple Threat and won back the title, and this time he had a beard. He did end up losing the title to him, but won it back at the Royal Rumble, only to lose it at the Chamber, and at the end of the night, this demon stole Kofi's spot and won the title from John Cena. Like, weren't you on SmackDown? He brought the title over and had this awkward build to a match that I believe was originally with Cena. Then they included the Big Show. Despite all that, they had a decent match at WrestleMania, but the best work had yet to happen. Because after WrestleMania, Edge started growing impatient and angry at the lack of a title on his shoulder, to the point where he was a totally different person than compared to his usual self. He had so much resentment towards John Cena for ruining his life, and this is a promo that I highly recommend you watch. It's definitely a standout from his career. Other than hating Edge, he had some pretty good matches with the likes of Jeff Hardy, and looking back, he was still one of the very best heels in the business at the time. Like, for me, all he had to do was show up with a title and I'd be hating on him. Looking at it from a different perspective, he could do no wrong at this point. You know, he was firing on all cylinders. He was in form. Jeff Hardy. Whenever I hear of 2008 to 2009 WWE, or just 2008 in general, I don't think of John Cena, Triple H, or whatever, but it's Jeff Hardy. This man was a huge part of my childhood along with a bunch of yours. Whether it was from the time period where he was jumping through tables with Matt, or in my case, when he finally captured the title. He was one of the most naturally over wrestlers. All he did was walk out to the ring and half of the fans would go crazy. At least at one point, because by the end of 2008, when the fans heard the drums to his song, everyone would go wild. He's just so likable. When you ask me why, I feel it's because he's authentic and real. He's a natural underdog and you want to see him doing well. The guys in the back, though, had doubts. You know, Hardy had some issues and they were quite hesitant to put the title on him. But we were all there for the journey. We saw Hardy unveil a darker side to him and start wearing face paint again, having those odd promos in the dark, and of course seeing him time after time fall short. But on the final pay-per-view of 2008 Armageddon, he did it, and for certain it's one of the very best moments of PG era WWE. As JR said, from daredevil to champion, from enigma to icon, Jeff Hardy was the champion. The thing that makes this victory special is that nobody knew if he was actually going to do it. Sure, you might say Jeff is winning the title, but you weren't 100% certain. The night when he came out and celebrated the title victory is one I'll never forget. Unfortunately, though, this title run was the definition of transitional, and after plans leaked of Christian's return, Matt Hardy, of all people, turned on Jeff Hardy. He was this babyface who was all hyped up, but at a moment's notice, look on his face, he's like he finally realized that WWE never pushed him or something. Now, I enjoyed this feud as a kid because, for one, it's 2009 Jeff Hardy, and two, I was a kid, but it could have been more, and Matt winning the match at WrestleMania did absolutely nothing for him. But back to Jeff. While things did falter after the Royal Rumble, he was still the most over wrestler on SmackDown and showed no signs of stopping. Eventually, somebody 10 years from now is going to be like, Jeff was overrated. But we all know they're wrong, and I'll clown them for it. All that's left is one man. The face of SmackDown, the game Triple H. Similar to Rey Mysterio with SmackDown, his name was synonymous with Raw. He had been on the brand for 6 years, and many wanted him to be on the blue brand, but apparently he didn't work Tuesdays. With the move to SmackDown, I feel Triple H upped his work in general. I know many don't like him as much as a face when compared to his heel work, but I think this was his best face run. For one, the change of scenery helps. He was on Raw for such a long time, and two, his in-ring skills were more consistent than recent years, and he had a better collection of matches. It also helps that he had great matches with the likes of Jeff Hardy and The Undertaker. And a random SmackDown had these two facing off in the main event. Of course, there's some blemishes there, you know, the program with Khali and Koslov, but other than that, the game was delivering. Near the tail end of this era of SmackDown, he started feuding with Randy Orton. We all know how good that story was, but then WrestleMania came around, and you can hear crickets. certificates. Regardless of that, if I had to rank Triple H's best years, 2008 isn't at the very top, but it's definitely closer to the top than it is to the bottom. Commentary. Around this time period, WWE thought it was time for a change and brought Jim Ross of all people to Raw. This man was the voice of Raw on and off for 14 years, and so it felt illegal in a way to see him on SmackDown. By his side was Mick Foley, but then he had enough of the shouting in his ear, so Taz was brought in. I don't really hear much about this duo, and honestly, they were just there. You know, JR still had some amazing calls at the time, but it wasn't the same. Taz, meanwhile, somewhat checked out, and only 2 days before WrestleMania, left the WWE, turning down a contract extension. In this case, it's a notable downgrade, in my opinion, to Michael Cole and JBL. Oh, and I'm still pissed that I missed this episode of SmackDown. Best match. 08-09 SmackDown had loads of memorable matches, whether it be on TV or pay-per-view. Edge and The Undertaker, Armageddon Triple Threat, Hardy and Triple H's 2 matches, SmackDown Elimination Chamber, a lot of choices. For TV, I'm going to go with Hardy and The Undertaker. This match came out of the blue and it delivered. Add to that, it had an interesting stipulation, interesting matchup, and an interesting story heading into it. Hardy had grown angry in recent weeks and turned to his dark side to beat The Undertaker. Of course, there's interference, but a win's a win. For pay-per-view, I'm going to go with Hell in a Cell. Undertaker and HBK would have been the winner, but technically it doesn't count since it was an inter-promotional match. Hell in a Cell provided a satisfying conclusion to the Edge and Undertaker story, and in a way, it's sort of TV 14 era's conclusion as well. Might be a stretch. Best story. This is so hard. Hardy's journey to the WWE Championship, it's easy as hell. The story is very dramatic, exciting, and as I said earlier, nobody was very sure that he was winning the title, and when he did, it was very deserving. Best moments. Similar to any other era of SmackDown, 08-09 had its moments. Triple H roasting Edge at his own wedding and exposing him in 4K, Edge asking Foley for advice on how to stop The Undertaker, getting sent to hell, the Brian Kendrick as interim champion, Jeff Hardy turning to his dark side to beat The Undertaker, Edge turning up at Survivor Series, Armageddon 2008 main event, Pyro Explosion, No Way Out in general, Edge whining to John Cena, Shawn Michaels holding the whole white funeral thing. Hell of a lineup there. What's the best? Well, for pay-per-view, Hardy's title win. For TV, well, for me, it's when Triple H exposed Edge. I thought that was a pretty hilarious segment. All was good from Edge's side for the most part, and then this sledgehammer-wielding guy comes in and raises hell. It also caused an unfortunate chain of events for Edge. So, that's definitely my pick. If it wasn't that, I would have chosen the HBK and Undertaker segment. MVP. Alright, I think if you watch the entire video, you guys know who I'm choosing. Yeah, I'm choosing Jeff Hardy. Nobody had a bigger impact than he did in this era of SmackDown. Triple H had a great run, Edge as well, but Hardy wasn't the man. His story was, for the most part, the most interesting throughout the year. Seeing him fall short, climb up, win the title, only to be knocked off the top of the mountain and having to feud with Nat Hardy. So, for me, it's a very easy choice. Jeff Hardy as MVP of 08-09 SmackDown. Alright, so that's the first video. I thought 08-09 SmackDown was fun. Obviously, there's some issues with it, but for the most part, the positives definitely outweigh the negatives. And this was a very fun video to make. It was very fun for me to go back to that time period and try to make a video out of it. So it was all good. All right, what did you guys think of SmackDown 2008-2009? Please comment down below. And that's it for this video. Make sure you hit the pedigree on the like button, perhaps the swanton bomb on the subscribe button. Peace. I'm out.